Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast, a breaking news edition of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. We got the whole crew with us today, Kip Adams and Benjamin Wolk, on this Sunday evening because Georgia's got another commit. Four-star linebacker Chris Cole has committed to the Bulldogs. He is the 27th commit in Georgia's 2024 class, the third at linebacker. The 6'3", 210-pound linebacker from Salem, Virginia, picks Georgia over USC, over Tennessee, a few schools that he visited late in the process before deciding he's going to be a dog. So we will talk about his commitment, what it means for Georgia, and talk a little bit about what's still left out there for the Bulldogs. Ben, I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about Chris, what stands out to you about him, and what it was that made him decide he wanted to be a Bulldog.
Well, the number one thing that has to stand out to you, or I guess two things, is really just athletically his length and his speed. When you watch him on film, I mean, it screams at you. It's no surprise. He, just like Justin Williams, who we talked about earlier in the summer, are guys that started their high school football careers as defensive backs, and just the nature of how the linebacker position is being recruited. Now, Chris Jones, and we'll talk about all, the linebacker room in general, he's a slightly different type of guy compared to these two, but Chris Cole is a guy that is athletic enough to be that sideline to sideline inside linebacker. He probably has the length and size to maybe be a little bit of an edge rusher at times, just depending schematically what Georgia's trying to do. He is just, a really, 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 really good athlete. And he's a guy whose stock has risen dramatically over the course of this spring. I don't think that if you would look back in January, Chris Cole would have been a guy that would have been mentioned as a potentially elite caliber linebacker that could have ended up in Georgia's class. By the time summer got here, he was pretty much considered that way across the recruiting services. So another really good pickup for Georgia. Landing three guys in this class at linebacker speaks volumes about what Glenn Schumann's able to do with his position group. I don't know if anybody in college football does a better job than Glenn Schumann's able to do with Georgia's linebackers. So huge win for Georgia. And to your point, Jordan, fighting off a couple of official visits that he took the last 2 weeks to Tennessee, to Southern Cal. I think this is a recruitment that Georgia's felt good about for a month or two now. But obviously, when you've got those last two official visits, it makes you wonder. And so securing that commitment today, about less than 24 hours coming off of his Tennessee official visit, big win for Georgia.
Got to imagine Georgia fans are super excited, especially with being able to get a little more bragging rights on a school like Tennessee with him visiting there just before he committed to Georgia. Kip, what do you think about Chris? And again, the fact that Georgia was able to win out recruiting him and getting him into this 2024 class.
Yeah, that's a huge aspect of this because, we kind of talked about Georgia making a move for Chris early on in the summer. He was a guy that got an offer in March and then, during a visit, then made the trip up at the end of April. We were kind of just still feeling our way through this linebacker class, trying to figure out, which guys were high up on the board. We knew that at the time, maybe one of these guys from Virginia would be in Georgia's class. We didn't know, which one, but, now them landing basically the two top linebacker prospects in the state, just how this cycle kind of went down for them. But I think really that official visit to Georgia was real big. I think that they had a lot of momentum there. I can't remember exactly when I put my crystal ball in. I feel like it was in the month of July where we kind of figured out, okay, he is a high priority for Glenn Schumann and this coaching staff. And it's easy to see why. Ben mentioned, just making that switch from defensive back to linebacker and having that, that athleticism, a little bit of a different kind of player, than Chris Jones in the aspect that I think his best football is ahead of him. He's more of an athlete right now than just a true instinctive linebacker. But I think Georgia is starting to make sure they have a guy like that in each cycle if they can, just because it kind of gives you a little bit more flexibility in how you use a guy like that, whether it's in coverage, whether you're covering, big tight ends or if you're needing to use them at the star position to cover the slot. I just think he's got that overall versatility to kind of help Georgia out in a lot of different ways. So obviously a big get for Georgia, back up to 27 commitments in this class. And, Glenn Schumann, again, just has to tip your cap to him because that group last year, we talked about it. Such an elite group. You didn't really know, what the numbers were going to look like this year, but you definitely, looked at it and thought, well, they're probably going to get recruited against a little bit with this group because, you can't really sign much better of a trio than that. And now we're looking at, right now, this trio compares pretty favorably to last year's group. I mean, these are three top 10 linebackers in the country, the number one linebacker on 24/7 Sports composite, and Justin Williams. And then you look at Chris Cole being number 6, Chris Jones being number 9. It's another outstanding group. So I don't know if we're going to be talking about next year's group like this year, but now you can't really, you can't bet against Glenn Schumann now. As long as he's at Georgia, I think they're probably going to be doing pretty well at inside linebacker.
I want to talk a little bit more about that. This class, like you mentioned, Kip, 27 commits, 3 5-stars, 16 4-stars, but those 3 linebackers. And Ben and I were talking about this before we started recording. After they got Raylan Wilson, CJ Allen, Troy Bowles last year, looking at this class, in my head, I said, okay, maybe they'll take 1 or 2 guys, but I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of guys that frankly don't want to go to Georgia because of how deep they are at inside linebacker. Well, that shows how much I know with what they were able to go do. Ben, what can you say just about the job Glenn Schumann and the staff have done convincing these top tier guys that, hey, the best bet for you is to come to Georgia? And, the depth chart may look kind of daunting, but, your best bet is to come to Athens.
I said it regularly throughout the summer. I thought it would be hard for Georgia to end up having a 3 linebacker class. I projected them to have 2 linebackers at times. And if you remember, they had DeMarcus Riddick committed. And I thought, okay, if DeMarcus Riddick stays in the class, that's Georgia's best bet to probably end up with 3 linebackers. But a testament to what Glenn Schumann always has, on the back burners, or what he has figured out when maybe some of us aren't totally aware of what is happening in the moment. He had 3 really good top 10 linebackers that he knew, even if Georgia were to miss on DeMarcus Riddick, even if DeMarcus Riddick were to flip, there are still 3 really, really good guys that they feel really confident in. And I think that, I'll be honest, I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they took the 3 that they took last cycle and are still able to take the 3. Again, there's a lot of favorable selling points at Georgia. And I guess it goes back to something that Chris Cole has mentioned every time that I've spoken with him, and it's the development. And that when he speaks with Glenn Schumann, there has been a very clearly laid out development plan since the very first visit that he took that Kip was calling out back in the spring. Glenn Schumann sat down with him. They had an hour-long conversation that very first time in Glenn Schumann's office where he talked about what development will look like for him at the University of Georgia. And I think that that's a big message that Georgia sends to its linebackers. You might not step on the field day one. You could. They've shown it with CJ Allen already. Obviously, Raylan Wilson started to get more run on Saturday. Freshman linebackers can play in this system if you put in the work and are committed to the development plan that Glenn Schumann's going to put in place for you. And so I guess that's really what it comes down to. People are buying into what you are today and what you can become before you get drafted into the NFL. And Georgia's proven that time and time again at linebacker. And so I guess that makes it easier as the years go on for Glenn Schumann, even though taking these 3 after the 3 that they just took feels almost impossible to me.
Kip, any additional thoughts on that? The fact that they've done this after what they were able to pull in the 2023 class.
Well, you start to just look ahead to the roster, how the roster shapes up for next year. And again, to Glenn Schumann's pitch, Kirby Smart's big on special teams. You get your start there, but you also you get reps on the field and you build upon that. But you look at Smile Munden, you look at Javon Dumas-Johnson. They're both draft eligible, after this year. And so that's a lot of snaps that are potentially up for grabs next year on the roster. So that's something to kind of look ahead. And then, obviously the fact that, CJ Washington getting the, going on medical scholarship kind of changed the calculus as well. So I remember us getting ready for SEC Media Days, and that's when we were kind of walking down to 24/7 Sports Studio, and that's when I started talking like maybe they're taking 3 linebackers in this group because, again, I think the numbers change, and especially with the transfer portal, Georgia's going to have double-digit guys just transfer every offseason. So you can't really just think about numbers in the traditional sense like they have in the past. Maybe this is just how things are going to be. and Glenn Schumann's going to try to sign 2 to 3 every cycle, because you just have to prepare for guys that, maybe see more playing time elsewhere, or just, their motivations or what they're looking for in a program changes. So I think overall, you look at the group, you start thinking about it, Xavier Story, Jalen Walker, EJ Lightsey. They have a strong group, but at the same time, again, depth today is not depth tomorrow. So it makes sense. And we could still look at this group and still think about how deep it looks on paper, but we might be talking very differently about this group next year. And to your point, just the fact that CJ Allen's come in and is playing over 20 snaps a game, I think that's probably all the pitch that Glenn Schumann needs, because that room looked deep as can be going into the season. And, even though we've just raved about CJ Allen since, December, I think, he's showing that you can come in and still play a role as a freshman at Georgia.
I want to make sure and read this YouTube comment from Jeff Daniel, who said, keep giving Coach Glenn Schumann raises, go Dogs. I would imagine that is the sentiment for a lot of people. And you guys hit on a lot of the points that I would have said. There's great examples that Georgia's had the last few years in guys who didn't play a ton, who wound up being drafted high: Channing Tindall, Quay Walker. And Ben, you can correct me. I was trying to remember the quote that Kirby had at some point during either fall camp or that week one getting ready for UT Martin. But he's basically like, you don't get drafted by playing. You get drafted by playing well and putting good film out there. And I think that's a huge piece of this. And I think that's what these players who are coming in, especially at a spot like linebacker, they understand that, maybe they don't start day one, but they can't really find a better place to get developed. And Georgia has done a very good job in the Kirby Smart era and the time that Glenn Schumann has been there on staff of developing guys. And, if they don't wind up playing a ton of snaps over the course of their career, they're going to see the improvement they need to one day go on, leave Georgia, and be able to play in the NFL.
Yeah, quick correction on the quote. I think it was, you don't make it to the NFL by playing, you make it by playing good, because Kirby's from Bainbridge, Georgia. So
you're right.
One thing I wanted to call out on Chris Cole too. I mean, we talked about the athleticism, but I think we should call out, he ran a 60-meter indoor time of 8.44. It's I think the fourth fastest somewhere in their time in the country in the indoor 60-meter hurdles. So this is a truly dynamic athlete that Georgia's adding at linebacker, and just go throw on his huddle film and you'll see how fast he is. Actually, I do the weekly breaking down Georgia commits on huddle. I don't do the targets just because I guess there's less targets now than there have been, but this will be my first time really breaking into the Chris Cole film as a Georgia commit. So I'm excited to do that later this week too.
Speaking of those targets, we've mentioned Georgia's got 27 commits, not a ton of room when you look at this 2024 class. I'll start with you, Ben. Who are the names that are left out there that, Georgia fans need to keep an eye on, and the recruits that we're going to keep an eye on as we look closer and closer and, see the calendar getting closer and closer to December?
Keep me honest if I'm leaving anybody out here, but we've got LJ McCray, defensive lineman from mainland Florida; Aiden Breland, defensive lineman from Mater Dei in California; Cam Michael, who, I know that we've written about what position he wants to play and how it might not seem as favorable for Georgia right now. And he was just out at Colorado, which I'm sure was a great time for him this past weekend. But he's the defensive back / more likely wide receiver from Statesboro, Georgia. And then there's obviously the KJ Boldens of the world, the Mike Matthews of the world, the in-state 5-stars that Georgia is going to continue to try and flip until signing day, that I don't think that they're going to have the most success with, but something to keep an eye on. And then the safety, who we don't know necessarily who that might be. Georgia just offered a safety last week that's committed to North Carolina. My best guess is that will not be the last safety that Georgia ends up offering in the 2024 class, but that remains to be seen. So those are the names that come to mind for me, but Kip, am I leaving anybody out?
No, that's it right now. I agree. I expect more offers to kind of go out this fall as they continue to evaluate. We're in the process of senior film getting made. People are blowing, kids are having big years and blowing up and giving themselves a chance to be evaluated more. And you also have to remember, coaches are just now kind of getting out during this senior evaluation period to be able to see players. I will say it's honestly the hardest time to get an eval done by any coach, because obviously the season's going on. Coaches don't even want to be on the road. They don't want to look at film. So if you're on the support staff at Georgia or anywhere other program, and you see a kid you love and you're trying to get, the position coach to look at it, good luck. It's almost impossible. They don't want to see it. They're going to push it aside. Not right now. But those evaluations will get done, and we'll see new guys emerge. And yeah, Georgia's taking guys late in the cycle, every cycle, and those turn out to be they've hit on a lot of these guys. I mean, again, you don't have to look far to see a guy like Glad McConkey out there. The Eric Stokes of the world, Austin Blasky, just a lot of guys that end up on the too deep. Get those late offers because of the senior film going out. And so I think that's kind of the aspect we just have to kind of wait and see, but we're going to keep an eye and see who's standing out in our eyes. So I'm sure we'll unearth a couple guys. And at the same time, I think Georgia right now is probably focused on the 2025 cycle. And they have a chance to get another big time player later this month in Ethan Barber from Alpharetta High School. Todd Hartley says, I'm never going to stop getting tight end commitments. So for him to have a chance to get a 4-star tight end in the 2025 cycle, probably he's going to sign up for that and go ahead and load that class up so he can work on 2026 through 2028 tight ends that are out there emerging. So still some recruiting news to happen this month, but I think right now Georgia's probably kind of locked down into the season right at this point.
You took the words right out of my mouth too about because Georgia has 27 commitments in the 2024 class, it gives you a great luxury to be able to look ahead to 2025 much earlier than most other programs are going to be able to. I think to your point, Ethan Barber on September 22nd, Georgia is looking in good shape there, especially him taking, he was expecting to go to the Georgia-South Carolina game. I think that's still the case, but he sort of somewhat surprisingly was in attendance for the Ball State game as well. So I think that, and he was sitting front row with Dylan Raiola too. So, I think that gives you an idea of what Georgia was trying to give as its last minute selling point. But Georgia's already looking ahead to 2025, and hey, Ethan on Friday night in Athens or in his high school game had 4 touchdowns in the second quarter. So it's a guy that I think will be able to be dynamic with the football like many tight ends we've seen at Georgia before.
Before we get out of here, any parting thoughts on Chris Cole choosing Georgia? Any other recruiting nuggets before we close out this podcast?
Yeah, overall, just like the fact that Georgia's kind of stacking guys that, have kind of a solid 6'2", 215, 220. I mean, it's just Glenn Schumann kind of has a type, and I think that they're, the length and the size of this group is just really impressive. And so overall, you kind of look at that and you like what guys like that bring to the table, because you're not just getting downhill linebackers who, sometimes struggle in coverage. You're getting guys that have outstanding range. And I just think that's really kind of been the focus the last couple of cycles. And across the board, this group looks like just an extremely explosive, linebacker. I guess now it's 6 linebackers in these 2 cycles. You really like what they all kind of bring to the table overall. A little bit of differences between them, but it's a lot to work with for Glenn Schumann. And so that, that position room is not looking to, take any downgrades anytime soon.
Ben, any thoughts?
I mean, this is a guy that wants to be a doctor too. So I think Georgia, Glenn Schumann, I think when Chris Jones committed, said something about I don't remember the exact 4 words that he chose, so I don't want to misquote him, but it was something to the effect of size, speed, but also something having to do with intellect as well. And I think that he's been very strategic with the 3 guys that he's added in this class, all 3 very sharp guys, all really high caliber students. Chris Cole's definitely in that category too.
Well, we'll wrap up that episode of the podcast right there. Appreciate everyone who checked this out live. Appreciate Ben and Kip for popping on with us to handle some breaking news with Georgia getting another big-time linebacker commit. Appreciate everyone for tuning in. Want to make sure and tell everyone to go to dogs247.com. All kinds of content about Chris Cole coming off his announcement. And be sure to go to Dogs247 on YouTube. Check out our videos, the podcast we do, the interviews with the players and with Coach Smart day after day going through the season. It's definitely no shortage of content there. So for Kip Adams and Ben Wolk, I am Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care.